Thanks a million, Barry, and thanks for having me here today. It's always great to have an opportunity to meet like-minded people who are trying to support the evidence for policy agenda, and nice to be able to connect in with the health and social care side in particular. But the piece that I suppose I talk to really is more the broader piece around evidence for policy and connecting policymakers and researchers in particular across all areas of government policy. So I normally start this by kind of going over the rationale for evidence-informed policy making in Ireland and key strategies that we have that are trying to drive this out. But I feel like a lot of people in this room already know this. In things like civil service renewal, the programme for government now has very strong actions in it around connecting researchers and policymakers in particular, and creating pathways between the two sectors and around mobility between research and policy sectors. And I suppose really the review that I would represent is, as Barry mentioned, Impact 2030, which is the National Research and Innovation Strategy, which was published back in May 2022. But I suppose, as I say, I think that at this point there is really a coalition of the willing. There is an agreement that we do need to drive this out in a more systemic and organised way. And I suppose the question is now really, and the work that we've been trying to do in DeFers is trying to understand what the Irish evidence ecosystem looks like at this stage, and in particular, what can we do with our little portion of it, which is around that piece on connecting researchers and policymakers, because as John mentioned, evidence-informed policymaking is a much broader piece, and evidence, is composed of so many different elements. But look, I'll move on a little bit. I suppose one of the things I would say is that from our work that we do see that there's a real emergence of nodes of activity across both the policy sector and the higher education research sector in the research for policy space. A lot of activity going on to drive it. And the other thing I think is that we've really, in the last few years since we've been working on this, have a better understanding of what evidence is and recognition that it is valuable and that it's important. It's always been there. Evidence structures have always been there, but as I say, it's just that spreading of the word across the sector. And the other thing that has really come to the fore recently is that piece around adopting a systems approach to evidence-informed policy making and trying to bring those dispersed nodes together in a way that's a little bit more organised, in a way that we can kind of share good practice around it. So now, this might seem a bit rudimentary to kind of start with key definitions, but again, I think it probably sets out a little bit the thinking around this. Sorry, I'm going to read off the screen from here. I hope you can still hear me. So that evidence-informed policy-making piece, as I mentioned, a process whereby there's multiple sources of information, and we're talking about statistics, data, evaluation, research. Also the citizen's voice. I suppose a lot of people in this room as well will be very familiar with engaged research and have had the experience with PPI and working with people on the ground in terms of developing the evidence base for policy. Research for policy then, which is the piece that we're really focused on, is around delivering greater engagement and linkages between researchers in the higher education system and policy practitioners to increase the availability of empirical data and research evidence, etc. The policy engagement piece, this is in itself an important component, because the thinking around evidence for policy has moved on a lot in the last few years. Moved on from this piece of just, as Barry I think mentioned earlier on, that transactional piece of you have evidence, you give it to me as a policymaker. And I think that really what we were trying to do under Impact 2030 is looking at the various different ways the policymakers and researchers can engage, because it happened in a myriad of ways, and to develop a more co-creation and partnership approach where you have researchers and policymakers working from the beginning around policy, around forming those research questions, around developing the research to support policy, but also around evaluation and implementation of policy as well. So there's a role there for research across the policy process. Now, so as I say, one of the things that we tried to do when after Impact 2030 was launched, is we thought we better try and get a better understanding of what the evidence for policy system looks like, or what kind of structures are in place at the moment. One of the key things we did was to try and establish structures which would allow us to pull that information together. Now, I think Barry or Fergal may have mentioned the Civil Service Research Network, which we established back in early 2023, I think, which is basically, I'll talk about it a little bit more in a while, but it's research leads from across all government departments, and we come together and we share our experiences of embedding research and evidence and policy development. And one of the first things we did when we brought the network together was to try and do kind of a very, I wouldn't say it was a deep dive, but kind of a map of what evidence structures look like across government departments. And so there's a lot of structures already there, like the Irish Government Economic Evaluation Service, within the civil service itself, the statistical network, these are statisticians that are seconded from the CSO. There's a kind of a growth and a proliferation of these kind of strategic policy units and strategic research policy units, bringing together all that expertise as well. We now have also new government science advice structures, which are also kind of emerged on foot of Impact 2030. We have a new government science advisor, and there's a forum, a national science advisory forum being brought together as well. Underneath that, underneath government departments, we have research agencies like the HRB and research performing agencies, which provide an awful lot of the evidence for policy. And there's a lot of data and information and depth there that that departments are leveraging in the policy development process. And then I suppose the piece that we have remit over, which is the higher education research sector, technological universities, institutes of technology, if there's any left now at this point, the universities and colleges of education, research centres, etc. So that's a very broad kind of, or a very top-level view of what the evidence for policy ecosystem looks like at the moment. So when we did that map, you won't be able to read any of this, but it's really just to show you how the system has evolved across civil service departments. This was a baseline mapping exercise that we did with the Civil Service Research Network at the time. And I suppose what I wanted to point out here was two things. One, that each of these clusters represents a department, if you like, and within each of those clusters then we mapped things like science advisory structures, IGs, the statistical service, and other expert advisory councils. Like, they're very different, and I suppose we don't necessarily want to have a kind of a common system across all government departments. Departments need different types of evidence. So, for example, PER relies very heavily on the Economic Evaluation Service, as you would imagine, whereas Department of Health, Department of Ag have, chief medical officers, chief veterinary officers, food safety experts, etc. So they're very, very different in the way they're structured. But when we bring that together in the Civil Service Research Network, there is a sharing there of expertise on how these structures have I suppose, developed, and how we can bring departments along and kind of, I suppose, raise all boats to a certain extent. So why research evidence? I suppose everybody in here would probably agree with these, but I suppose it's no harm to kind of talk about it again. I suppose one of the things that really kind of drove it home was the need for an organised evidence system following the COVID response or the COVID crisis. So I think that piece around the crisis-driven is one piece, but I think as well public trust in decision-making has become a really big issue for policy development. And you can see this a lot in Europe, and you can really feel the tone of it at the moment, and particularly, and John would say this, can speak to this as well in America, obviously, the kind of maintaining that trust in science and maintaining that trust in policy development. So the connection of the two, it's one of the key reasons why we do it. The multifaceted nature of challenges, the need for us to leverage the expertise in the research sector to kind of inform us on really those complex, knotty issues. Community insights within research. Researchers are often the connecting tissue between us and our people on the ground, the voters, citizens, and the issues that they're facing. To maximise research impact throughout the policy process, that's the piece I mentioned earlier on, around research impact coming in from forming the policy question right through to evaluation and policy delivery. To leverage the expertise within the higher education research sector, I'm going to show you some graphs here now from our research and development budget, and you'll see the extent of the capacity within the higher education research sector that's there, that can be leveraged. And it's not really just that policymakers want to leverage it, it's researchers are trying to connect in and have that input into policy and ensure that policy development is more robust. Combat disinformation, I suppose that's connected into the trust piece as well. apologies, sorry. So yeah, so this is we do the the FIRS is responsible for the National Research and Development Budget, which it surveys about 50 government departments and research and their public service agencies underneath them to try and capture expenditure on research and development, personnel numbers, etc. The reason why I'm showing this is because we can see that the bottom line here is actually the number of research personnel in government departments, and although it's coming from a very low base, it has been increasing steadily since 2013 to a point where we now have research and development personnel of around nearly 1,400. The next grey line on the top is the researchers within, or the research and development personnel within the higher education research sector. So I suppose it's just to kind of demonstrate that there's a lot of expertise in this sector that we could be connecting in with and that we're really trying to connect with. The next one then, I suppose, is actually researchers, whereas the last one is support staff, research staff, etc. Researchers within the government sector have also increased quite a bit. I know, again, coming from a pretty low base, but coming from 437 in 2013 to 857 in 2022. So it is growing. I think the recognition that it's probably a combination of things, the need for research expertise within government departments, and also just generally that upskilling of the population, and more people holding PhDs and coming into the civil service, seeing it as being another avenue of employment as well, and another opportunity to leverage their research skills. So one of the other piece that we did that map of the civil service side, the policy side, to see what an evidence ecosystem kind of looked like. And I have to say that we now have a number of projects which are, including Mark Boyle and Sean O'Fowler here as well. We have a number of projects now which are looking at the evidence ecosystem and translating research into policy in a more in-depth way. So we're hoping to get more detailed and in-depth understanding of what that research to policy piece is, knowledge brokerage, research networks, etc. But we did do a consultation on a research to policy framework a couple of years ago as well to try and inform our work in connecting into the research sector. And we went out and we asked researchers in the sector what were the issues they were facing in terms of connecting with policy, and what was their experience of connecting with policy, and I suppose the areas of focus that they felt we should be addressing when we're trying to build that framework for engagement. So access to resources is a big issue, obviously. Having ring-fenced time to actually engage in research or policy-relevant research, particularly for early-stage researchers who don't maybe have the know-how, the knowledge of the policy development process, or even the motivation to kind of engage in policy-relevant work. The lack of forums for communication, whether they're informal or formal, there's certainly, I suppose, that need for clearer pathways between the two sectors. Ring-fence time for policy work, that's a similar point to what I was saying earlier on, and I suppose inbuilt into that is that challenge between the time horizons on the policy side and the research side, and I suppose that feeds in or speaks to the recipes and the rapid evidence piece that we're talking about as well. Access to statistical data, space and capacity, expand knowledge on processes. Researchers often don't fully understand how the policy development system works, and I think that Fergal talked about this as well. There's a certain, I wouldn't say suspicion, but I suppose a lack of understanding across both sides in terms of how the policy side works and how the research side works. Clarity on points of contact, connectivity and pathways, and centralised advertisement of opportunities, because there isn't really a central hub which brings all this kind of thing together. Researchers often are missing the opportunities to connect in to feeding into policy development. So coming from that, then I suppose the areas for improvement that we've identified is the need to build those centralised mechanisms to support HEIs and government departments to connect together, to build those contact networks and system-level engagement mechanisms, and to build a two-way understanding of the research system, policy development and communication through training. So I suppose it's a capacity development piece on the research side. You're talking an awful lot about understanding of the policy development process, dissemination, communication, and even that synthesis piece. And then we've been doing a little bit of work on the policy side as well to try and build up those skills and that absorptive capacity for research within the policy sector as well, and how to embed it in the policy development process. Incentives to engage, I think this was touched on earlier on. I suppose the structures like COARA, which is the initiative to drive out better recognition of diverse policy or research outputs as well, is going to, we're hoping, will kind of help. But we're trying to move away from that just being those publications-focused incentives to, I suppose, recognising researchers' impact on policy. A tricky thing to do because policy researchers are not often, I suppose, cited in policy documents. So we're trying to think of ways there, or expand ways there, to incentivise researchers to engage, and also to incentivise policymakers to try and connect into the research piece. Now, a little bit more just on, a little bit more about the work that we're doing in DEFERS. As I mentioned, the Impact 2030 is the National Research Innovation Strategy would represent the DEFERS view on that strengthening engagement piece, and I suppose our view of the evidence-informed policy making process. Since the strategy was published in May 2022, we've actually moved on with a couple of developments which are helping that connectivity piece. I suppose we have the new national agency now with Research Ireland, which is bringing across expertise and funding across multidisciplinary research areas. So together with HRB, we're really building up that research funding activity, and I suppose there's a lot more policy orientated and policy connectivity research going on within the agencies. The National Grand Challenges Programme, again, a lot of focus on kind of mission-orientated challenges and mission-orientated funding, research funding opportunities. Strengthening the impact of public research system on policy making, I suppose that's the piece that we're doing in DEFERS. There's new science advice structures, as I mentioned, and this is around connecting researchers and research capability. And again, I suppose that's bringing the science voice into the room, particularly around those, I suppose, priority areas as well. Now, so the piece that we've been doing, as I said, we started off by, I suppose, what we're trying to do is develop something that is, I suppose, specific to the national context. So the key thing there was around building up an understanding of activity across both the research and policy sides. So, as mentioned, we established a civil service research network, which is the research leads across government departments. We also established higher education research for policy group to bring in that strategic voice around how to engage with the higher education side. We've established a new higher education research for policy advocates network, which we're trying to build up and drive out that activity as well. The open consultation gave us a real insight into the the experiences of researchers on the ground in developing or engaging with policy. We've had a number of, I suppose, research policy interactions in practice. Speaking at what was SFI Research Summits, we've had workshops as well with researchers and policy makers. But the whole idea is that doing that, I suppose, it's a bit meta. It's evidence for policy and evidence for policy. So that's the evidence piece that we've been engaging with. And I suppose what we're trying to do is support engagement and relationship building, and kind of highlight good practice and signposting around how to drive out engagement and the wider applicability and policy considerations, driving out, I suppose, a bit of clarity around the articulation of policy needs as well. So I mentioned the Civil Service Research Network. This network has actually been invaluable to us because it's the first time that we've been able to bring research leads across the departments together to actually discuss how they're actually engaging, how their structures are, I suppose, have been formed and have evolved, the activities they're doing, and how they're successfully or unsuccessfully trying to connect into the policy sector and build up the evidence needs for their own respective departments. It's a sharing forum. It's a kind of a good practice forum. We do have a work program of issues that we're trying to work through, from accessing journals to researcher access to national data sets, administrative data, procurement. We've a number of issues that we're kind of working through. And then I suppose the focus really is around establishing those engagement mechanisms and structures between the two sides, and supporting capacity building is the key thing there. So it's really around the development of structures and supporting capacity building on both sides. Oh, sorry. Now, emerging practice and activities. So the kind of things that we've been seeing really growing in the last couple of years are around the clarity on research priorities. A lot of government departments now are actually publishing their research priorities. It takes a bit of work for departments to kind of, I suppose, get organised internally to identify research priorities, and particularly for researchers or for policymakers who can be very busy with the everyday business of policy making, kind of having that projective and that foresight piece, thinking ahead on what policy needs or research needs might be, and where we could potentially engage researchers. And several departments, including my own, have actually published our research priorities, followed often by calls for evidence to bring in researchers to engage on these. Procurement, as I said, we had a subgroup of the CSRN looking at procurement, bringing together that experience of procuring research and how best to do it. Fergal mentioned the knowledge brokerage events. There have been several of these popping up. We had an event ourselves a couple of weeks ago around that systems approach to evidence-informed policy making. That's been a really good opportunity to build that network. Trying to highlight case studies as well, bringing them together. We pulled a few from our own consultation, but we've been able to share those at Research Ireland, for example. Research open calls. I have an example of the DAFM one there, but there's lots of departments are doing their own individual calls as well. And then there's a growth in these opportunities for exchange, mobility between research and policy sides. The Public Service Research Fellowship in Research Ireland is just one. But I suppose the other piece around capacity development is that evidence synthesis piece, and we've been engaging with Evidence Synthesis Ireland as well to try and build up that capacity on the policy side. I won't get too much into this, but I suppose it's just to say that we've been supported a lot with Europe, and we're very plugged into it. The Science for Policy and Research for Policy agenda in the European side has been, there was a staff working document, a European Commission staff working document in 2022, which was trying to signpost, I suppose, good practice in science for policy and opportunities for engagement. And I mentioned here too the Council conclusions on strengthening the role of impact and research innovation in policy making in the Union, and then the Ghent Declaration on the challenges and common areas of action. But we're very much involved and connected into the communities of practice and networks there. And I suppose our next step here is we recently, I suppose, introduced or raised awareness of a new technical support instrument project that we are about to start off. I suppose, like I said, we've done an awful lot of mapping and trying to scope out and build that coalition of the willing over the last few years, but we're now at a point where we really need to kind of reflect and see what the evidence system looks like now, coming from that baseline of a few years ago. So the TSI is an opportunity it's supported by SG Reform, and along with our colleagues in the Joint Research, the JRC and the European Commission, we plan to map our evidence ecosystem as it stands, and then I suppose really build on a set of recommendations there on how to bring it forward. So the areas of focus, it's a 7-country project, which means that we collaborate with a number of other countries who are also mapping their own national evidence ecosystems, and that's been really useful in terms of, I suppose, feeding into good practice and also learning from good practice in other countries. But the focus really is around increasing institutional capacity in government and government departments in the public sector, improving professional competence for policymakers and scientists. The JRC have a competence framework for scientists and for policymakers. They're also looking now at a competence framework for knowledge brokers, which should be very interesting. Community building, supporting national and EU communities of practice, and resilience building, that should say they're building the political will and leadership. So that project is now kicking off in, I suppose, Q1 next year formally, and I suppose it will be a good opportunity to see how we've actually come on since Impact 2030 was launched back in May, and to see where we can, I suppose, what we've succeeded in doing and what maybe are the areas of improvement to bring on our work. But anyway, that's kind of a whistle-stop tour of our experience of scoping the sector and trying to drive out the connection between the research and policy sides. So thank you very much.
Okay.